Okay, this is section 3 of the Building of Global Empires. This time we're going to be talking about the emergence of new imperial powers, specifically imperial powers in the United States and in Japan. Before we move on, however, what I'd like to do is take a minute to do a little bit of review from class. Here we have a political cartoon that was drawn around the time of the imperialist period, and it was conveniently titled The White Man's Burden. In a moment, you're going to see a question popping up that's going to ask you to tell me what you think the historical significance of this image is. I would like you to think about what is this political cartoon saying, and does it reflect the reality? So I'm going to stop talking for about 10 seconds so you can take a look at it and pause the presentation if you need to before the question pops up. Okay, let's move on. So first we're going to look at the United States becoming an imperial power. Remember, the United States, as you all know, had broken away from Britain in 1776 and had written a Declaration of Independence, declaring that all states, all people have a right to self-determination, and we're endowed by our Creator with the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those American values come into conflict when we are in competition with other European powers who are expanding their empires. This dates back as far as 1823, where we have the Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine said simply was that the Western Hemisphere, the Americas, is the province of the United States and should be free of European interference. We claim the right, the exclusive right, to interfere in American politics, Latin America, South American politics, and stated that Europe had no place there. So, to quote from President James Monroe, who was obviously the person who came up with the Monroe Doctrine, on our right we have a quote from his message to Congress. "The American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintain, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers." Again, the idea was that the Americas are not allowed to be touched by European powers. Of course, that doesn't say anything about the United States. Consistent with this, again, we talked about westward expansion in the Americas and the closing of the West towards the end of the 19th century. We also see in 1867 the purchase of Alaska from Russia. This was called Seward's Folly because of the belief that we were purchasing a frozen, uninhabited wasteland from Russia. We subsequently find out, however, that Alaska is rife in natural resources, in particular oil. And so Alaska has become, in fact, so profitable for the United States that if you are a citizen of Alaska, instead of paying taxes to the state government, you receive a check from the government as part of your share of the oil wealth. The other thing we see is Hawaii. Hawaii was an inhabited, independent island that was ruled by the Hawaiian people. However, as American businesses become increasingly involved in Hawaii, the last queen, Queen Lulukalani of Hawaii, is overthrown, and businessmen in Hawaii ask initially for Hawaii to become a protectorate, a protected territory of the United States. And in 1898, the same year as the Spanish-American War, Hawaii is actually annexed, becomes officially part of the United States. It doesn't receive statehood for more than 50 years afterward, but it is an official territory of the United States. Let's move on. That brings us to the Spanish-American War. This is one of the most telling moments in world history. Remember, we had Spain, who discovered the New World and who, from the late 15th century through the 16th century and into the 17th and 18th century, was the world's preeminent power. They became tremendously wealthy as a result of the silver brought back from the New World, along with cash crops and sugarcane, indigo, etc. But as we know, Spain was also one of those countries that was particularly resistant to industrialization. And their resistance towards industrialization, plus the influx of silver currency, led to mass deflation of their currency and led to significant economic problems. And so the power of Spain by the turn of the 20th century had significantly waned. They still had significant territorial holdings in the Caribbean, including Cuba. And when the USS battleship Maine was settled off of the port of Maine, of Havana Harbor, and it exploded, it put into motion a series of events that had been building for a number of years. First, the United States, all the way going back to the founding of the country, had looked at Cuba as inevitably becoming part of the United States. Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson both believed that Cuba would soon become part of the United States. In Cuba, under Spanish rule, what we see is the Cuban people being brutally oppressed by a general named Weyler. Weyler developed the name the Butcher. He moved the Cuban people who, following a Cuban insurrection, he took the people living in Cuba and relocated them to concentration camps. These concentration camps, unlike the Nazi concentration camps, did not have the express purpose of killing them, but it did have the purpose of putting them all together. But you put a group of people together with limited access to drinking water and the ability to have proper hygiene, limited food, you're going to see sickness. People are going to get sick and people are going to start to die. And so in these concentration camps, we see a number of thousands of Cubans dying. The United States looks at the treatment of the Cubans and is sympathetic, plus it has the desire to annex Cuba. It's strategically important, and we've had a long history of thinking that Cuba was going to be part of the United States. And so when the battleship Maine explodes off the port of Havana, we never know why the Maine blows up. It could possibly be because in those old battleships you had the boilers right next to where we put all the munitions. And so you had this hot boiler right next to all the gunpowder, and there were instances where other battleships of that make and model would explode. The Maine explodes, and because of the yellow press who is pushing for war in the United States declares war against Spain. And the United States wins. The United States wins against Spain, which had been the world's most powerful navy. They win against Spain in a matter of a few months. The Spanish-American War is called the Splendid Little War because it is so short and so few of our people die, and we get so much from it. We get Puerto Rico, we get Guam, we get the Philippine Islands. Cuba becomes its own independent country with the idea that it's going to become part of the United States. We get a little piece of Cuba just off the coast called Guantanamo Bay, which is going to become important later on in our history. And again, this is all in part through the yellow press, through publishers pushing Americans towards war. This is one of the political cartoons that was published during that time period that illustrates. There's no evidence that Spain blew up the Maine, but certainly the media gave the impression that it had, pushing Americans towards war. We acquired the Philippines, and at the turn of the 20th century, between 1902 and 1904, we see a brutal civil war because the Filipinos do not want to be possessed by the United States. The United States, in fighting that civil war, kills over 200,000 Filipinos, and ultimately we're able to end that civil war and bring them under American control. So from the years 1898 until 1949, when the Philippines is granted independence by the United States, the Philippines is part of the United States. It is one of our territories. To continue. We also, during this time period, are constructing the Panama Canal. Initially, President Theodore Roosevelt had gone to the Colombian government, who owned the territory that is now modern-day Panama at the time, and asked to build the canal. They refused. And so the United States helped create a rebellion in Panama. These rebels created a new country. They called it Panama, and the United States was quick to recognize it. Part of the deal with recognizing Panama as an independent country was the right to construct the Panama Canal. It took 11 years. It was one of the most technologically impressive feats of that time and during our own lifetime. It connected the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. It cut weeks off of travel and made it much safer, and it brought in a tremendous amount of money for both the United States and Panama. We recently gave Panama back to the Panamanians, but for quite a while the United States controlled it and reaped the financial benefits of that. To continue. That takes us to the other industrialized power at the time, which is Japan. Remember back to the last chapter, and that Japan was the one country of the ones that we looked at. We also looked at the Ottoman Empire, Russia, and China, who really embraced westernization and industrialization. And they look at the... So the Japanese, like other European powers, had a desire to expand. Remember that Japan, like Britain, is an island nation, and it has access to very limited natural resources. So in order to fuel its industrialization, it needed to expand outward to get access to those raw resources. For instance, we're going to see that during World War II, they're going to expand to Indonesia for access to rubber and petroleum. However, we're still looking at the 19th century. So in 1870, we see Japan taking the northern island of Hokkaido and the Kuril Islands, then Okinawa and the Ryukyu Islands. Move on. Expansion comes with conflict, and conflict often leads to war. And so we have, from 1894 to 1895, the Sino-Japanese War, the war between China and Japan. We've covered this, so I'm just going to hit on this again briefly. So the Qing dynasty is collapsing in on itself. We see rebellion in Korea. Chinese army is sent to restore order. Japan intervenes, leading to war against China. And once again, just like we see with the British, the Japanese destroy the outdated Chinese fleet. This leads to Japan receiving the Korean Islands, or the Korean Peninsula, Taiwan, the Pescadores Islands, and the Ulandong Peninsula. Significant expansion into Asia, which is something that the Japanese had long desired. So we see Japan making a foothold into mainland Asia. What this is going to lead to, in part, is during World War II, the Japanese are going to absolutely brutalize the Korean population in extracting resources in order to fuel their war efforts. Let's continue. We also covered the Russo-Japanese War. Again, the conflict between Japan and Russia. This is where Japan emerges as a world power. And once again, the powerful Japanese Navy destroys the Russian Navy and the Russian forces, leading to territorial expansion. Again, one quick note of historical significance for people living in New Hampshire is the Russo-Japanese War ends in 1905 following the signing of the Treaty of Portsmouth, and this was the treaty that was overseen by President Theodore Roosevelt at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard right here in New Hampshire. So, this is going to be the end of Section 3. It's very brief, and then we're also going to be briefly finishing up with Section 4 on the legacies of imperialism next time.